I've been so impressed by the energy and enthusiasm and intelligence in this room today. We've heard some incredible things and so much food for thought. I don't know where to begin. So I think I'm going to punt and begin by inviting the other panelists to reflect on some of what they've heard today. And then I have a whole lot of questions to facilitate a conversation among us and then with you. So why don't we take this in the order that you're listed in the program. So Mary Margaret, you're up first.
Okay, this is on. Well, it's almost like there's nothing more to be said, but I find myself going back to Beth's opening remarks, which I almost wish she could give again right now as our closing remarks because they were so spot on. So I'm going to punt by paraphrasing Beth a little bit. She talked about making transformative socio-aesthetic spaces and the importance of spatial narrative and creating an emotional response within people. And the awe is within our bodies, that it is biological, and that in the works we do, we can move people. And it is through design. It is through transformation of spaces and making place that we can do these things. And so I think about Kate's lament about how we can't design ourselves out of the eco-side. But I think about the hopefulness of Lisa talking about how we are equipped to help make these things happen. And I think about the project in the Bronx, I think, that is so small, but it is changing lives. And it is having that awesome response in those kids who live there and see that place. And Martha's climate grief and Barbara expressing it so well for all of us. So I think that we have to come full circle and think about, okay, is it Kate who said we're the best planet? So we're the best equipped, I believe. We may not be uniquely equipped, I think we're the best equipped to lead these projects that will happen and are happening around the globe. And we can't leave it to the engineers, we can't leave it to the architects. We need to be the prime consultants. We need to lead these large scale, to the largest we can, even the small ones, these transformative projects that will then end up with the beauty that we just heard described in these native landscapes. So it's sort of a full circle.
Amy, you're up next.
Oh, wow, that was so good. You really were paying attention. You weren't in the ladies' room or anything. So first of all, what an incredibly energizing day to come back into an in-person event and be surrounded by all of these extraordinary women. So hats off to Charles. Where's Charles? You know, I have to say, like, this is one of the most inspiring days. And as Charles knows, I find women to be incredibly powerful forces in nature, right? And he knows I will never pass up a chance to say, if you could get an army of 20,000 women, Democrats, Republicans, all that are like climate warriors, people that believe deeply in natural climate solutions, people who believe deeply in diversity. I had the chance this year to try to organize women from the Garden Club of America to work on climate legislation. All of you need to talk to your local garden club because those women want to help you. And they're everywhere, and they're fierce, and they really do care about the birds and the bees and all those issues. So anyway, I'm all about the women and all about the power, and I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this today. And so if Beth asked us to be courageous in design, I think we should also be courageous in organizing ourselves. in political power, right? If you were to count up all the constituents touched by all the projects we talked today, from Signy's Bronx project all the way up to taking on the Mississippi Delta, right? Imagine the power of that, right? And I know from the work that our foundation does in democracy that often it's the environment that ends up being the thing that everybody can agree on and they do want to organize around. So I think there's incredible power in the work we heard about today. And I think women are particularly good at collaborating and working together. And so I just feel like there's an opportunity here and that we have been training for this moment for a long time, right? We've been studying design with nature since the McCarg era, right? We've brought technologies forward to understand the complexities of how these things interact. I think a lot about Dana Tomlin's work at Penn and Harvard and Yale and creating geographic information systems. That was a landscape architect that did that, right? So we have this extraordinary ability. And I felt like today it was fully in display and that we are uniquely suited to take on this climate moment. Where I think we're not suited is that I think we're radically not representative of the constituents that need this work, right? From Martha's point about the fact that the people that will be disproportionately hurt by this crisis, they aren't represented in us today. Right? And so I think it is incumbent on every single one of us to find a way to change that in our field and diversify that. And I also think we need to clone all the Heather Morgans because she's unbelievable. And she understands government in a way that we need to understand it at every level. And I also think we need to understand finance because there's a whole lot more money coming down the pike for climate action. If natural climate solutions is 30% of what's going to keep us sub 2% climate change, temperature rise, that's a lot of money. Someone's paying us to remove invasive plants. Whoever thought that was going to happen? That was never going to happen. But that's actually happening now. And if we don't think creatively and we don't deploy our special talents in landscape, and to be able to impact and disrupt those systems, we're really missing an opportunity, and it's something that we don't have time for. And I'll just finally say that if there was ever a sad moment in New York City to assess the philanthropic and government appreciation of the public realm, it was truly in COVID. So when COVID hit, all of my colleagues in philanthropy got together and they're like, we're gonna do a COVID fund. We're gonna do an $800 million COVID fund for New York City. And you know what, we're gonna do housing and food, and we're gonna do the arts. But not one environmental organization was gonna be included in that COVID fund, not one, right? So that not only meant that they weren't getting funded, it also meant those of us trying to still resource the environmental organizations of this city who are caring for the public realm, everything from the Central Park Conservancy to the 104th Street Beautification Project. They had to go out and try to find what dollars were left after COVID had taken all of those dollars. And not to say that any one of those things is more deserving, but clearly New Yorkers walked to parks. Clearly New Yorkers got out onto streets during COVID. So I just think we have a lot to do with our government and in philanthropy, and I'm going to just say I'm signing up for the push in philanthropy. Well, if it's not for the Martha Schwartz of this world, we have no leaders. So we love you, and
I'm serious. I mean, we need a place where we can do that. I agree with you. It'd be great if we could actually pull ourselves together and figure out exactly not only what to do, but how to do it. You know how to
100%, 100%. Thank you. Great day. Thank you. Yep.
I have a specific couple of calls to action to propose to build on what you're saying about political power and breaking with business as usual, going with the décalé plus a little more. But I want to start on a personal note, which is unusual for me. My team at the Climate Museum is always urging me to be super personal in public appearances. I do a lot of them. And they drag me kicking and screaming into it. they'll be shocked to hear that I initiated anything like this. But I think, Charles, it was probably a solid 2 years ago that we first spoke, right? Because you are a good planner, and you planned the original June 2020 conference well in advance. So I'm on my phone on the street, and Charles calls and invites me to speak at a landscape architecture conference, and he makes this unbelievably charismatic and charming pitch, and I was like, but stop. I don't know anything about landscape architecture. He said, I know, that's why it's so great. So I agreed to be the token ignoramus with great pleasure at the time. Doubt it. And at that point, we only had a few staff members at the Climate Museum. We're in startup mode still. We're developing a cultural activist approach to engaging communities around the city, including environmental and climate justice communities, with the existential threat that we've been struggling with today. And I'm happy to say, have since then grown a lot, and we're now at this point that the many people in this room who have started a business, whether it's for-profit or non-profit, will recognize of like triumph or disaster is 4 to 6 months away. We're either gonna make it or we're not, and we don't know, and if we do, it'll be incredible. And that is not at all implausible, but there's an alternative story. There's an alternative end to the story. And so for that reason, it was extremely difficult emotionally for me to come here today, because I really didn't know if it was even a defensible use of my time in relation to the project that I've nurtured to this point. And I just want to express my gratitude for the unbelievably bracing intelligence, for the generosity and the kindness, and for the freshness of vision that I've encountered throughout this day, because it has changed my day, but it has also changed my outlook in a really profound way that I want to share with you guys. I cried a couple of times. Barbara, of course, I cried with you, but I also cried when the katydids started singing. And I think that this is a milieu with an incredible degree of transformational capacity, an incredible degree of insight into multiple systems and how they connect with each other. And I want to urge you guys to use that power, that collective intelligence and that collective emotional generosity to launch a campaign like the one that health professionals have launched, declaring climate, in that case, a public health emergency. The exact language, the exact framing, I don't know what that should be, but people love the work that you do. Rebecca, people love your park so much. They love your park so much. They love the work that you guys do so much. It's about beauty and nature and the birds and the bees, and people love you and they love your work. And I just urge you to form a coalition, a sign-on letter. I don't know who the right person to organize it is. I do nominate Charles on the basis
Yeah, Charles.
of his executive capacity, which I've witnessed firsthand, and his ability to talk people into doing things, which I've also experienced firsthand. But I really think that a sign-on letter, you could get tons of press for it. You would be connected to the work that you do every day. Many of you in the room are my age and have seen the changes that have happened in our lifetimes. You can talk about it in a first-person way. Please use the traction that you have to get some media attention on another group of professionals that can help manifest how the climate emergency is an everything emergency. It's a social justice emergency. It's a nature emergency. It's a biodiversity emergency. It's an emergency for the birds and the katydids. And it's an emergency ultimately for human civilization. That may be a niche concern, but if you're still in love with the human species, despite it all, as many of us are, it's an important niche. So I want to make that call to action. And then just as a side note, since this is such a critical week in Washington, D.C., can I see a show of hands for who's willing to call the White House or Senate Majority Leader Schumer and say, pass it, fully fund it, we don't care what you have to do, but please, please make that happen. Can I see a show of hands? It's a huge moment of inflection, to use a phrase that recurred through the day. I'm so moved by you guys, and I would love to be part of anything else that you ever organize, Charles.
Okay, Olivia, you're batting cleanup.
Yeah, right. Oh gosh, this is such a huge challenge. I really feel like an outlier here, and terribly honored to be on this stage with such amazing people and brilliant thinkers and creative minds. And I do have to add my thanks to Charles that he would invite me to be a part of this. And I feel that the best that I can talk about and ask you all to do is to sort of think about things beyond the room, just as Miranda has suggested. I work at City as Living Laboratory, which was founded by an artist, Mary Miss, who is a beloved environmental artist, and who works on with landscape architects very often, and her practice is really about helping people experience the world, experience nature, experience urban environments afresh, anew, differently, by bringing together different disciplines. And that's one thing that I wanted to circle back on. Charles really stole my thunder earlier today when he asked for a show of hands of the non-landscape architect people in the room, and that seems to be something to really think about, and perhaps to be more proactive in getting those folks here that you need to work with and that you're already working with, and that can bring knowledge and a more sort of universal dynamic. Obviously, climate change is a complex challenge, and we need to have complexity in our addressing of it, and we also have an untapped resource in artists, and that's, my mission here is to convince you all that give that a try. I think it was so wonderful, and I really didn't want to come up here as a result, and Edwina ending with Laurie Anderson singing a song in her very ironic and provocative way. She never sings anything simply. She sings it in a way that, kind of gives a little twist to the knife. So just a couple of other random thoughts. The word landscape was probably used a million times today, and I think it's problematic, and I was really impressed, and I've now forgotten who it was who suggested that instead of the term landscape, we use sustained, engaged design as a way to encapsulate and sort of better express the field. So what does sustained mean? Months? Years? Decades? Centuries? Millennia? And of course, we're dealing with the centuries of human activity now in the Anthropocene, and what we are doing right now will impact the world for millennia to come. And on a kind of a day-to-day working level, we find that 10 years is a short horizon. I know Kate was talking about it took 8 years to get the living barriers in place, and we need to face that fact and make that time investment in order to have an increasing impact. Engaged. What does engaged mean? Dialogues, workshops, compassion, contemplation, or jobs? All of those are valid. Design. Is design creativity by profession, vision, visionaries, reflection, assessment? Another one of the presenters today said, solutions are not the only goal. So all of these things together create a wide variety of experiences. Is design about creating experiences? My last word that I'd like to, which I think you've all suggested, is really a part of what next, or we propose it as a question, what next? And that is sharing. How are we going to raise awareness? And Miranda, you were really encouraging all of us to think about that in more proactive ways. Toolkits, of course, are something that were being developed by a number of the presenters today, which could be invaluable. But I also like to think in what we do at City is Living Laboratory is not just how to do it, but how to keep it going. Maintenance is one way of describing that, but we like to think of it as activation. So once something is created, it needs to be followed up. It needs to be, an continued evolution of collaboration and seeing the future in new ways with different people. So different disciplines, different backgrounds, different issues. So I think that's all.
All right. Thank you. Thanks to all of you. That was. Well, let's try to get a conversation started amongst us first, and then we'll branch out and include all the rest of you. Amy, you sort of threw down the gauntlet by saying, this room isn't really representative of the people most at risk. At the same time, everyone agrees that there's an incredible energy and intelligence in this room, and that we need to reach beyond the room. But how specifically do we start engaging the people who are most at risk, do you think?
Well, I think the stakes are real high, right? As Martha was talking about, and we certainly studied this, Charles McKinney and I, Charles did some amazing work in Brownsville, where we look at the same heat index maps, and we also understand what heat vulnerability means, and understand that if you look at heat vulnerability across New York City and you look at an income map, they line up pretty nicely, right? So how do we engage those communities? Well, I think, we know from the Million Trees Initiative in New York City that built out this amazing thing with the U.S. Forest Service called StewMap. Does anybody know what StewMap is? I don't want to talk in jargon here. It's basically a map that tries to put a point to every single organization that maintains any piece of the 5 boroughs. And, we thought it'd be a couple hundred groups. It turns out to be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of groups, right? Each of them have a stake in this work. But we haven't actually figured out a way to deploy the StewMap as a political tool. Now, the Forest Service isn't supposed to do that, right? But there's certainly organizations and people that are able to think creatively about
Stew
how we
is
organize.
short for stewardship?
Stewardship.
Okay.
So the
It's not
point
an
being,
acronym.
So StewMap, there are really extraordinary tools in New York City, but we have never, as a city, to my understanding, ever found a way to build the power that the libraries build, for example, right? They get everybody out to city council and they march and they get really good funding for, well, probably not nearly enough, but much relative to the Parks Department or to our enviros that have never really been able to organize. So I think on the New York City level, there's ways to use tools like that. I think we need to just also think hard about the pathways to this profession for people that really could learn and engage more with this work, right? There's some fabulous organizations. Do people know Black Space? Black Space is awesome. Please learn about it because it's an amazing growing organization. Black Land, I sat in on one of their conferences this year. I was blown away by the quality of the work and just the topics that were raised that hadn't been raised in other professional conferences that I attended. So I think there are good organizations growing nationally that can do this work. But man, if we don't do it, we're not going to nearly get to what we need to do. And I know Charles is on a new race and space topic for the Cultural Landscape Foundation. Don't mean to steal your thunder, sorry, my friend. But the notion that there are so many landscapes out there that are disappearing, that haven't been documented, that nobody has ever really invested in, and that's because there's just one story or a series of stories being told.
Do the rest of you have thoughts about this?
Well, I would broaden that to talk about not just reaching people as we're doing projects or as we're doing advocacy or as we're trying to start initiatives. I would talk also about reaching youth, because we need to change the face of our profession, and college is too late. So we need to be reaching out to young people to help them understand what landscape architecture is and what can be done through landscape architecture to get them into our practice. I mean, I just want to refer for a minute to Julie's amazing, brilliant interview. And Judy Woodruff on PBS introducing it by saying, landscape architecture, like she'd never heard of such a thing. Like, oh my God, what is that? It was very, very revealing, I thought. And so having those kinds of faces out there, Charles, brilliant in getting, that kind of exposure. So landscape architects leading projects, people like Julie out there as spokespeople in a national kind of way on PBS, and then reaching kids, as well as the advocacy, the initiatives, the politics, et cetera.
I'll zoom out very briefly, but adding an organization, Harlem Grown is a local organization that does gardening in West Harlem, and your pipeline point, I think, is spot on. And it has to be an active effort. It will not happen, it's not gonna happen naturally, it's not gonna happen organically, but making sure that low-income communities and communities of color are affirmatively reached out to and put into pipelines that can lead young people into this amazing profession that I now wish I could join after today, is incredibly important. Zooming out just a bit, we've been hearing from brilliant women all day long that we need to think in terms of systems change and we need to break with business as usual. Radical change is coming. It may be catastrophic change, or it can be change that we instead direct to a much greater degree, and that can result in a genuinely deep, positive social transformation. You really couldn't have the climate crisis without systemic racism, nor vice versa. And you have to go back to the roots of colonialism and extractive mindsets and philosophies that are now completely naturalized. We now buy a plot of land, poison it, shave it down, deprive it of everything it needs to live, and that feels like our staked out territory. That's the new business issue. What does it give us back? It gives us a sense of ownership and space. And all of these things need to be, Edwina, to use your phrase, flipped on their heads. This sounds too big to be feasible, but so does every major change our society goes through. It always feels like it's too big to happen until we come together to make it happen. And in moving in a just and well-considered way toward climate justice, we will end up transforming the hierarchies that have gotten so much more rigid in American life and internationally, and that result in the kinds of exclusions that you're talking about, Amy. So learning about and understanding the interconnections between racism and class hierarchies on the one hand and the climate crisis on the other, and not just taking that as a political talking point or an article of faith, but genuinely thinking about how those things are connected, and what we have to do to break those bonds is really transform both systems. You can't have one change without the other.
Here, here.
Weigh in, Olivia?
Well, I just want to say that part of that is being able to elevate people's perception of the environment, and we need to have the tools to read landscapes and the knowledge to decode them. And that's a very, I'm sorry, going back to artists, that's one thing that artists can do, but it's also something that's highly interdisciplinary, and it's not just something you wish could happen. It really is a process of working together on creating that understanding and that communication.
Let's turn to a question that I think is of great interest, especially to people in this room, which is what the issue Kate raised this morning about it's not design. I think this is something we really need to put to bed. That there have been endless debates about is it art, is it science, is landscape architecture design, or is it planning? Is it design or infrastructure? And so this question keeps recurring of, well, it's not design. Does it matter what we call design?
Well, I'll dive in because I think the future of our work as landscape architects is completely integrated with infrastructure. I don't think there should be an infrastructure project in this country that doesn't involve amenity. Public utility as amenity needs to be our future. But there's not that many greenfield sites. We're not going into a place and just creating something beautiful. We're dealing with toxic sites. We're dealing with brownfields. We're dealing with abandoned lands. And we're finding our opportunities through projects that departments of transportation need to do, that the Corps of Engineers needs to do, that various infrastructural projects are our path to our future. So it's all design. It's all landscape architecture, and it's a collaboration with many other disciplines. And I'll say it again, we're the right ones to be leading it.
You're here.
Well, I don't understand why there.
You'll have to speak up. Do you want a mic?
No, don't give her a mic.
I don't understand why any of that would be exclusionary. You have to build, shape, any of that. So why not actually, after you address all the issues that need to be addressed, but beauty is something that we need. It's something that is part of our own psyche. It affects us, but it doesn't mean that you're not doing other things. It's not one or the other.
Right. We've gotten over binary thinking in so many other categories, whether it's race or gender or whatever. So let's get over this kind of binary thinking in design. Get over whether it's design or infrastructure or art or science or whatever. It's a continuum, and some things are going to be more toward infrastructure and more.
Let's face it, if you're creative, you're going to want to do something that makes something beautiful and connects to people, because we're still here on the planet, but it doesn't mean that you're not solving solutions to problems.
That's right, and I want to add, I think that too often landscape art, and many of you have heard me say this before, I think landscape architects become design apologists. It's like design is bad. It has to be environmentally, it has to be socially responsible, it has to be this, it has to be that. Well, ultimately, we make place. Ultimately, we are forming places that move people. And yes, we're doing all those other things, but we are designers, and we should not apologize for that. That is the vehicle through which we can make these transformative places based on all these underlying matrices of responsibility to the environment, to social justice, to equity, to wellness, et cetera.
At the same time, though, there is this issue that design disappears into infrastructure. So do you have to apologize for that?
No, what I meant was don't apologize for standing up for the word design, for saying design matters. Mm-hmm. Now, we're involved in infrastructure projects, and it takes battles, tooth and nail to keep the design part alive and showing, and you have to threaten to quit, and you have to threaten all kinds of things. So you only apologize if it fails, but.
I'll take a stab. Okay, I'm going to say that I think it's the superpower, right? It's our superpower, right? So if you can take that design thinking and you can take it to different sort of applications, right? I mean, one of my favorite projects that I've been thinking a lot about is the Renewable Rikers Project. Which, I don't know if people know about this project, but the idea that you transform one of the greatest human rights violations ever in America into a place that becomes an engine for renewable energy, clean water, reconceived waterfront in multiple boroughs. Like, that's just like actually too hard for the city to think about, quite frankly. But you almost need the design imagination to figure out how the city could even tackle something that's big and that complex, right? So I think it's our superpower to be able to take complex issues and to be able to translate and execute on that. I think that's something that landscape architects have in spades, and I don't think that government and other disciplines really have to cope with the complexity that landscape architects do, and I think it's fundamental to the design, so.
Charles.
I feel like there's a juicy tidbit that we're leaving on the table.
I'm giving Charles
Okay, I promise to give it back. I'm not going to go full Oprah.
So there goes the afternoon.
So
Charles has got the floor.
one of the conversations that we've had as a sidebar that started last night was the issue of the word maintenance. And, you know, after watching the last 3 presentations prior to this group, the question that you asked John to provoke, you know, design, I mean, you just got Martha's gander right up. It was like, what took her so long to shoot out of her chair kind of scenario. But the reality is we should be saying design and stewardship, because I think to put all of the responsibility on design and target design versus other topics, we were, you know, previously we've been talking about race and space and, you know, how I would be looking at authenticity and conflict with design. So let's talk about that same question and talk about design and stewardship going hand in glove and what those 2 words mean when we put them together. What do the panelists have to say about that?
If you don't have communities involved in the stewardship, then it's not going to happen. So that's one thing that I would put out there first, be it an understanding of what the landscape is and represents and functions as well as, you know, the actual getting down there and saving the plants or the bees or the, so it has to be a communal effort.
I'm going to throw into Miranda on this one. You ready for this? Do you know we're actually cousins? Weirdest story. I'll explain it later. Anyway, so we talk about maintenance like it's this millstone, right? Like, oh, the maintenance, it's so hard, it's expensive, no one wants to pay for it. But when you think about it, and this is my point for Miranda, we talk a lot about climate jobs, right? We talk a lot about the opportunity to build jobs, and if we're going to do big-scale forestry restoration across the country, that's jobs, right? We can restore I think we have to stop thinking of that as a negative and look at it as something that could actually be an asset to the work that we're doing, right? Do you feel that way?
100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it also makes me think about, this came up briefly earlier in the day, wanting to be careful not to vulgarize, but indigenous concepts of stewardship and care, and the idea now popularized by a laundry detergent brand, that you take care of the earth for the people 7 generations away from you. And that's very grand and big, but we need to have very, very big visions and very big conceptions that we then operationalize with small moves, recognizing the impact that those small moves have when they're in the service of that bigger vision. And I absolutely think that on climate and jobs, the idea of stewardship and the idea of taking care has been devalued in our culture, in part because it's feminized, it's associated with women, right? That's another thing. that we need to flip on its head and turn upside down. Taking care of what we still have and what we can have is job number one. And I say that as a person who thinks about design in a more narrow sense all the time in terms of our art shows and our work across the Climate Museum's programming. But the idea of stewardship and caretaking has to be central to any balanced approach to the climate crisis.
Well, how do you think that actually will work? And I'm asking really quite honestly. I did a project in front of the HUD building in Washington, D.C. 30 years ago. It's still standing there. It hasn't been maintained once. I mean,
That plaza with the circular planters.
Martha's saying that
How do you do that? I mean, you don't own it. You know, you're asked to decide it to solve problems, whatever. And then that's it. Yeah, it would be great if people would maintain.
well, we did hear some ideas about this today, about transferring some of the money from capital budgets to maintenance budgets. I mean, there are practical things like that to do, but
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, we all know that every client wants us to design a maintenance-free landscape, and that's just ridiculous. We just built a big project in Oklahoma City. It's a 70-acre project that connects downtown Oklahoma City to the river. They have the money for maintenance. They can't find the people who want to do gardening. And this is heartbreaking. So I'd like to brainstorm with you. How can we make gardening something that's appealing?
Well, Signe and I were talking earlier, and we were saying, wait, we haven't said anything about OMB. We got to bring up OMB. So the Office of Management Budget, whether it be at the city level, the state level, there is, and this is really the work that has been talked a lot about by my colleague Deborah Martin, who's such a fabulous landscape architect, but the fact that there is a fundamental disconnect in the way a place like New York City looks at its operating budget versus its capital budget. And this idea, can't we just transfer money over? That does not happen. That's not actually possible. But there is such a fundamental disincentive for someone to create a high-performing landscape if it has an iota additional cost in the installation, even if it's going to save the city tens of millions of dollars. It doesn't win points for the folks that are doing the maintenance. So there are some structural problems in the way that the city finances itself. It's a huge issue, but I think it's something fundamental to addressing this perennial headache and annoyance. And it doesn't meet the moment for climate at all.
Right. I think some of what Heather Morgan was talking about really does address this issue. And even though she was specifically dealing with emergencies and things that are more to disaster related in terms of resiliency, but you could see through her, sort of chain of command there and the opportunities that are available to inculcate staff members at the different agencies into this whole process. That's one. That seemed like a bright light on the horizon to me. I mean, we're right now trying to do a project that's funded by FEMA, and it's all about community engagement. And if that kind of the value of those types of maintenance and stewardship for particular areas that are vulnerable right now, if that gets sort of inculcated into FEMA, then it could spread in many directions across the United States.
I might throw out another question and tip my hat to Beth, as the rest of us have done this afternoon. Beth talked this morning about how landscape architects, garden designers have to toggle among disciplines. And she talked about the need to be courageous and humble both. And that's just some of the ways that people today have been talking about this phenomenon of toggling. There's toggling between the micro scale project and the macro scale project, toggling between individual and collective responsibility. How much responsibility do we have as individuals versus how much should fall to federal and state and local agencies. The toggling that in some ways has been most compelling to me today is the toggling between despair and optimism. And I think we've seen plenty of both. So how do you sustain this kind of toggling? I mean, we've seen a lot of evidence of success and optimism on smaller scale projects at the same time as, for example, Kate really stressed how insurmountable some of the larger scale issues seem to be. I've been involved with this group down in Washington based at the Smithsonian called Earth Optimism. And the premise is you can't solve anything if you don't think you can do it. So you can't go to the moon if you don't think you can do it. You can't cure cancer if you don't think you can do it. So we probably won't solve the climate crisis unless we think we can do it. So how do we sustain that kind of optimism when the macro scale challenges seem so daunting?
Christiana Figueres, who's an incredible international climate leader, for those who aren't aware of her work, without her, the Paris Agreement would not have happened. She brokered that deal. She talks about stubborn optimism. So we can, stubborn. So we don't have to insult our own intelligence. Our situation is currently bleak. And it's important to tell others the truth about that as well. It's important to be direct and clear and even emphatic about that. But we don't, in a stewardship mindset, we don't have the right not to fight. And the very fact of fighting, especially if we do it in community with other people and with each other, gives us optimism. It is a highly unusual human being who isn't made more optimistic by a sense of shared purpose that is acted upon. That's probably one person in every 200,000. Everybody in this room has moments thinking about the climate crisis of the most profound and disabling despair. I know I do. But when we reach out to people with whom we can be open about that, or even sometimes, if one of those people isn't around for your grief, if you reach out to take an action based on your understanding of how we need to be in this world and what we need to do next, you will feel better and you will feel more optimistic. And that's a good thing in itself. That's a good thing in itself, but it also helps you. It's also part of a spiral. It's a virtuous spiral of collective efficacy. It's this term that social science researchers use, which combines the ideas of strength in numbers and a positive self-fulfilling prophecy. So it's the opposite of that feeling that I have every time in my life. It hasn't been much in the last few decades because I've had the social power to avoid it, being at home plate with a bat in my hand, knowing for certain that I'm going to strike out, which naturally always happens. The opposite of that is not being alone at home plate, but being with other people and knowing that you can succeed. It'll be hard. We're going to have to go through more suffering than we've already endured, more losses, but this is something that our species can do. And it starts by reaching out to one other person. And that is how the toggle works for me.
So personally, I think this is where we're fortunate to be landscape architects, I think. I have a brother, he's a physicist, and he is almost brought down by his despair about our climate. I mean, seriously. I maintain hope and optimism with every project I do, because with each new project, there are new opportunities, there's connections you make, there's people you inspire, the transformations you make change people's lives, and I think we are lucky to be landscape architects. Yes, we keep getting beat over the head as well, because with each project there's failures as well, or disappointments, but that's why we keep going.
I'll say that since I don't spend my days anymore, sort of thinking a lot about landscape architecture all day. I work in sort of aligned fields. What I find is exciting is that I get to spend a little bit of time investing in innovation. And I think just the conversation earlier about investing in kids, right? But investing in innovation so that in the time that I've been doing the work at the Kaplan Fund around this thing we call the Innovation Prize, we've just finished our 4th round, we asked for people to submit their crazy, wild idea about climate. How are you going to address climate? And in each round over these last 7.5 years, we see more bold, more creative, more expansive ideas around climate, and it's encouraging to me that people who would probably never have talked about climate a decade ago, investment bankers, like here's a really creative way that we can monetize ecosystem function and get public utilities to pay for forest restoration to stop fire cycles that destroys watersheds. Like we can monetize that. Like, wow, you can do that, right? So there's things, I'm encouraged because I see innovation happening and I see it in sectors that go beyond the room of people who have spent a long time thinking about ecosystem and ecosystem functions. So I guess leaning into growing, to Miranda's point, one more person and getting one more person engaged and seeing more and more traction in groups that hadn't been very climate aware before.
I have a really perverse response to this challenge. And through reading and other artists' work that really conveys the ultimate apocalypse of humanity, I sort of feel you can get to that point and say, okay, that's the worst. Where do we go from here? And I can visualize the end of humanity, and I can say, well, maybe that's a better solution, but that's not my solution, and so I'm going to continue to work with colleagues and associates and friends and do the best.
If I can just add a super quick postscript, for the people who have siblings who are physicists or whose work otherwise doesn't lend itself to this incredibly lucky sensibility that I think most of us in the room are privileged to have, of being able to work on in a way that affects this crisis. It doesn't have to be your job. You can become a climate protagonist in a bunch of different ways in your community, in your workplace, urge your employer to take climate action, for the people you know to raise their voices to elected representatives. I won't go through all the options because they're clear to everybody in the room, but it doesn't have to be at the center of your work life to have that, for you to gain that sense of optimism and connection that we're talking about.
We have about 15 minutes left, and I think it's time to turn it over to the rest of you to ask questions. Martha, you want one more quick one?
Okay, sorry. No, actually, I'm going to say why we can all be optimistic. And I know this is going to sound weird, but for the past 5 years I've been studying this. We are going to be saved, most likely, through a technology that the science is working on. It's called stratospheric aerosol intervention. I know you think I'm crazy, but I'm not. This is going to happen at some point. But also, we aren't going to be able to save the world as landscape architects. I agree with Kate. However, what we are going to be able to do is to make the world a hell of a lot better for the future. And we have to regenerate the earth. So all of these things have to be done at the same time. Keep on going. It's so important what we're doing, but we're running out of time, and that's why stratospheric aerosol intervention eventually is going to happen to cool down the earth. So you guys can take it easy. No, not debated. That's going to happen.
I'm going to walk down the aisle here with the microphone and.
Okay. So one of the things that struck me while everyone was talking is that just in the last, let's call it 20 years, we start connecting the dots of all the green spaces that we're creating. That's optimism. I mean, no one project is going to solve it all, but it's connecting the dots. And that's why I'm walking away incredibly optimistic, because will we get there before the end comes? I don't know, but we're going to connect all the dots, and we're just going to keep connecting them for a more resilient landscape. So I'm optimistic. Thank you.
Other thoughts, questions, comments?
To your left, John.
Oh, to my left. Oh, okay. Yeah.
I don't know if I can articulate this. For starters, I'm not a designer, I'm a communications person. And part of me has found this one of the most inspiring days I've had in many, many years since before the Trump administration, let's be honest. And yet, it's hard to imagine engaging children and next generations unless there's some fundamental, really big change in the way we educate children. And we live in a country where tens of millions of people aren't getting vaccinated against every basic idea of science. And what backs everything up that we're talking about is science, right? And so this toggle between despair and optimism, which is, I sort of feel like all I think about every day, it's like a huge preoccupation. It seems to me somehow like a crisis of education and communication, and so deeply, deeply systemic and political, and I know that's not a question, but it's sort of an expression of a lot of thoughts that have kind of been floating today. And I'm sort of just throwing it out to you. You brilliant, brilliant panelists and speakers.
Hello, I'm on the ASLA New York board, and on the topic that's been discussed about this room not really representing the diversity of our community, I just wanted to say that the week after next we're having a DEI, what do we call it, a town hall, and it's going to be online, and you can go on the ASLA New York website to get the information, but we're going to basically try to facilitate a discussion about steps to be able to rectify that, or to start to anyway. So I just wanted to say that.
Thanks. Thank you all. It's been a real privilege to be here today. I'm a landscape architect, like many of you. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is our own individual work lives and how somewhat out of kilter those are. And we're totally tied to computers every day, yet we're designing these outdoor spaces. And I really, I have a small practice of my own, but it's out of whack, And so we're sort of preaching to the world about what we should be doing, but have to figure out from a business perspective and a wellness perspective how to reorient our own lives. And it's not just our practice or our field, it's many fields, but wonder if you have any thoughts on that, or you're thinking about that as well.
Yes.
Okay. Do you care to elaborate?
Well, I think about it all the time, and it is a dilemma. And I think all we can do is make sure that we don't let ourselves get sucked into those screens all the time. We work with each other. We work with other people. We need to get out to our sites, and we need to get out to other sites, and we need to give people time to be outside of the computer space, and we have to mandate it as part of our office cultures and our studio practices.
This is Charles McKinney. I ran many parks, and do not underestimate the power of a gardener. Everybody talks to the gardener. Do not underestimate the dignity that it gives to a person who has a chance to work in a nurturing environment, nurturing some specific area that they can point to their children that I did this, and to get to know it over time. And it doesn't require a college education. And if I were in charge of this stimulus bill, people would have work, because the fundamental problem now is dignity. You know, we're motivated by fear, and we're threats to our dignity. And I've hired people who were just this side of homelessness, who had the intelligence to be a gardener. And nothing has given me more pride than to watch them, thrive in a good workplace.
Well, I just want to throw out something just to our dear friends at the Central Park Conservancy, who have just employed their first returning citizen crew working in Central Park. And I really do believe that our public open spaces should be welcoming and receiving places for employment for returning citizens, formerly incarcerated folks, and that interaction that Charles is speaking with, this idea of being in the public realm, speaking, being thanked by people for thank you for making this place better. There's so much opportunity for us to bring justice to public open spaces, and I really want to give it up to Central Park for piloting that, and hopefully, like many things Central Park has done, spread that as the gospel to open spaces and park organizations across the country.
More thoughts, questions, comments?
Thank you. Grant Anderson, I used to work for the New York State Parks Department, and one of my first projects was actually working at a facility with Charles McKinney. And I remember I was working with the Friends of the Park group, and it was like, okay, go do community outreach. And the simplest question was, one of the parents said, hey, can you come to our school and talk about this project? It was the most amazing experience of my entire career. I've been doing this for 35 years. The best experience I could tell you was standing in that little classroom when the kids said, hey, what can we do in this park? And 20 hands went up. And they had 20 different answers. I said, yes, we can do that. We can do that. Well, we're not doing that for this park, but we can do it later. And I would love to have been able to follow up with those kids and say, how many of those turned to this profession? I don't know. But I would encourage every person here, every single time you have a public park, turn around to your community group and say, hey, I'm going to offer you, I'm going to come to your classroom, I'm going to talk to your kids and tell you about this park. I'm going to tell you how to get into my profession. You could be a community gardener. It doesn't require a college degree. You could go to the local community college and get an associate's degree in horticulture. Boom, you're working at the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens. There are so many ways to get in here. We don't do enough in our profession to encourage minority representation, women coming into the profession. This is the most women I've seen in any seminar I've been in decades, in one day on a stage. So, thank you. But seriously, go and offer your services. It's an hour of your time to encourage someone else to come into this profession, and guaranteed down the line, you'll have some kid walk into your office, say, hey, I saw you 20 years ago. I became a landscape architect because someone else spoke to me in my school. What better way to recruit people into your own office, in your own setting, when you could talk to the local school and get them to come into your school, into your practice? It's self-fulfilling. Go out and talk to the people in the school and educate them right away.
Great, thank you so much. I think we're out of time. In closing, I might just say, this morning Beth was talking about effective landscapes, and I wasn't sure if she was talking about affective landscapes that work upon you and change the way you think and experience things, or effective landscapes in the sense of landscapes that work. And I realized in the end that she was really talking about both affective and effective landscapes. And that's what I'm taking away from this event today, that there's an incredible amount of intelligence and energy going into creating landscapes that are both affective and effective. And I want to thank our panelists for this session. I always go into these kind of panel discussions with trepidation because I'm never sure whether we're going to hit it out of the ballpark or not. But I think you really did hit a home run. So thank you so much to all of you.